Welcome to Restoration Movement Conversations. My name is Josh Stuckey. I'm the host today. I'm here with my co-host, Jamie Franke and Mark Nichols. And today we're going to be discussing something that is happening in the news right now. This is a special episode with regards to the tragedy of the news of Phillip Yancey's adultery. When we're going to be discussing about this, we want to be clear that our goal for today is not actually to talk about Yancey himself very much, as the greater issue at hand is the issue of sexual sin among Christian leadership at large, and what each of us can do to potentially at least help stop this temptation in our lives and in our churches. This issue is actually fairly personal to me. I've had, for whatever reason, my life's path has led me to be affected by this issue multiple times. And one of those times that I can actually share on air is the man who taught me how to preach ran off with his church secretary. And I found this out in my mid-20s, shortly after I graduated Bible college. And he had been a professor there and a preacher. And I knew him well. He taught me well. And at 60 years old, he ran away with the church secretary. Destroyed his ministry, his credibility, really hurt the church. And students like me were left flabbergasted, like, how can this happen? And what do I do with what I've learned from this man? So sin has consequences, and it's always bigger than we think. And also, sexual sin has happened regularly across all brotherhoods and denominations, also in the Catholic Church, and probably it's happened for all time. No person or generation is immune. We must be vigilant if we want to stop this from happening where we. Any thoughts, gentlemen, before we proceed?
Just a quick comment. And, we're all aware of the big names in the media and things like that. When media loves to grab hold of these issues and these cases to just make a mockery or a point that says, look, Christianity's no better, than we are. And but it also has happened on a personal level, just like you've said. I've got personal friends who I know that I went to Bible college with who in full-time ministry who are no longer in full-time ministry or had to step away for a season because of sexual sin. So it is very prevalent.
And I think, too, its destructive path is much bigger than what we wish it was. And Josh, what you pointed out, I think, is really a key issue with all of these is, what do we do with what in your case, what you learned from the man who taught you how to preach? And what does that mean for that? And we think of that similarly, whether it's big names that have written books like Phillip Yancey, or whether it's people who are relatively unknown, but yet they've had an influence on us. And that, I think, is a big question we're left struggling and grappling with is, what do we do now moving forwards with them and with the information, with what they've taught us, that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, we do want to briefly review the Phillip Yancey situation. Phillip Yancey is a longtime Christian author who for 55 years has published and spoke publicly. His book, What's So Amazing About Grace, was his breakout hit back in 1997. He reports that he grew up in a very strict church where God's love was de-emphasized and his imminent judgment was always right around the corner. Instead of rejecting faith entirely, he discovered God's love through Scripture and desired to bring that message to the masses. Yet, after his now publicly known 8-year-long affair, his brand is destroyed, his message is compromised, and his future influence is nullified. This is a lot like the Steve Lawson situation from 16 months ago and the Ravi Zacharias situation before that in recent times.
So I'm curious, Josh, if I could just ask a question of you two, or I guess I could answer first. That is, how influential has Phillip Yancey been on you. And I guess from my perspective, I could say not really too much. I've read a couple of his books, I think. We did use his study, What's So Amazing About Grace, in more than one of our Sunday school classes. There's been somewhat of an influence, but this doesn't hit close to home because I was really well, influenced, but some people certainly have been. And what about you two? Has he been I'm just curious.
Yeah.
And
As recent as my master's degree study, we had to read a book, or it was at least recommended to us to read it. The Jesus I Never Knew, I believe, is also a
Mhm.
Yancey book. And so that was recent. But I'm like you, Jamie. He didn't have a huge influence or impact on my ministry necessarily, but definitely familiar with the name and his work.
I worked at a Christian bookstore as a teenager, and I remember when What's So Amazing About Grace came out and it flew off the shelves and it was a big deal. I remember kind of quickly, going through it, not reading it thoroughly, but I was a teenager. I didn't have the attention span to read a book back then, but
Right.
all the same, I would say when I was younger, it would have had a much bigger impact on me than now. In fact, one thing to really note is that I think with age, and I think all of us would agree with this, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm pretty sure all of us, being older men now, we don't really idolize people like we used to.
Right.
I don't put people on pedestals like I used to.
Mhm.
I sort of, and I want to be careful about this, I sort of expect people in general to disappoint me. So I put faith in God, His Word, and I love people, but I don't necessarily put them on a pedestal or think them better than me or anybody else. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just wondered if maybe there was if each of us have somebody who was it shocking or surprising when they had a fall from grace moment, either a big leader in a church or someone, and if it's personal, clearly don't mention their name necessarily. Although, I mean, Josh, you allowed us to in on that a little bit, but is there somebody personal or that meant a lot to you or that you admired in their ministry, and when the news came out that they had a sin or something like that, that it just hurt you more than what you thought it would? And I can go first. One individual that I wouldn't say I idolized him, but he definitely influenced a lot of my preaching style, and I certainly do not agree theologically with him on every point. Okay, I was able to sift out the good and reject the bad with his theology, but was James McDonald. He was the preacher at Harvest Bible Chapel, and scandal came out. He was in a private meeting and some things came out, what he said, and in that private meeting, the things that James McDonald said were secretly recorded and then released publicly to a radio station. And then that brought up the controversy, which led to his dismissal. So he is no longer in full time pulpit ministry. He does have a ministry. He moved to Florida, and he does have a men's ministry where he continually works with men. But that was one who had it was disappointing to me that the man who I saw, that I heard, that I listened to, read his books, was not the same man privately. So, any of you two have a situation?
Really, nobody comes to mind for me to a huge like a huge influence or that became a crushing situation for me. I mean, there have been times when I've heard about, well, similar to what Josh is saying about a preacher ran off with the secretary, and you hear about that, and it just makes you feel terrible. But I don't recall anybody that I've really looked up to that that has happened to me. But sure makes you feel for people who do. I could imagine, what if somebody like for me, like a Jack Cottrell or a Gareth Reese or a Lloyd Pelfrey, that were very influential on me. What if that had happened about them? That would have been really
Devastating.
heartbreaking, to
Yeah.
say one word. But I can't say that. And I'm not thinking of any examples right now.
Yeah.
I can even take this back to my childhood. I had family that was really into Jim Baker when he was on TV in the 80s and the televangelists were really big. And then his scandals got revealed. And I just remember the fallout as a kid of people being like, oh, you just can't trust them televangelists. And it's really started for me at a young age to just kind of be skeptical, not cynical. I don't want to cross a line and say everybody's terrible. No, but just realize that everybody's human and we should be careful how much we elevate anyone.
Well, and just real quickly, I mean, just I don't want to belabor this point, but gosh, it has almost happened to every influential leader that is at a mega church, if you will. I mean, it happened to Tony Evans. It happened to Matt Chandler to some degree. It happened to Mark Driscoll out, with that. James McDonald. You had all these guys who were influential with their writings and with their preaching in their style, and it just seemed like domino effect. Each one had different issues and had to leave or been disqualified in their ministry in some way, shape, or form. So I think this is all that to say this, Josh, and I don't mean to get us off track, but this is a very relevant topic for us to talk about even before the Phillip Yancey situation.
Certainly. All right. So let's try to do our best to answer why does this keep happening and what, if anything, can be done to help prevent it. So I'll begin here. When this happened, I was unpleasantly surprised. I don't think at my age I can be shocked much anymore, but still surprised and unpleasantly so. Didn't want to see this happening, was sad to see it happening. And there is a particular YouTube channel that I don't agree with the theology necessarily, but he has good material when it comes to this issue of morality, and it's called Wretched, and it features a man named Todd Friel. And he discussed this situation, and he came up with 10 reasons that I thought were pretty good about why these things can happen. And I just thought I'd use it as a basis for discussion here. So let's take a minute and discuss the possibility of spiritual complacency, that a man gets tired, lazy, overconfident, lacks a prayer and a private Bible reading life, and a lack of vigilance of looking out for Satan, who's always looking to devour each of us. What would each of you say about the potential for spiritual complacency contributing to this?
Well, I know one scripture that comes to my mind is from 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And I don't know if that falls really under, I guess it would fall under some spiritual complacency, or maybe under maybe one of the other topics here, but it would fall into this, that if you get to a place that you just think you're somehow immune to Satan's attacks, you're in the most dangerous place of all. And I confess that Josh, you mentioned Steve Lawson, and I confess I really didn't know anything about that. So ahead of time, I looked that up, and as I understood it from what I looked up, he was 70 years old having an affair with a 28-year-old woman. And he was like a dean of a preaching connected with John MacArthur's church, or at least the Master's Seminary, I think. He was from Texas, Steve Lawson was. You stop and think and I don't know, I have no idea what his mindset, anything was. I don't want to act like I'm able to say this is what Steve Lawson was thinking. All I'm saying is that if you ever get to a place that you just think, well, this could never happen to me, or I'm above this, or above the danger of temptation or whatever, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall.
Hmm.
And that, I think, is such an important passage to remember in the context of this discussion.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, to one scripture that I feel like is key to this whole thing, and it's one that is the I mentioned it in passing with the heart and soul of our men's ministry, but it's 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul is writing to men, and this is his information. He says, "Be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." And I feel like, Jamie, that is exactly what I would say is you got to be on the alert. And that's the command, just what you were saying, to be aware that don't ever think well, this can't happen to me, because right when you think it can't happen to you, that you would never be tempted in that way, that's when Satan's going to be like, "Oh yeah?" And try to do that.
That's
I
when
think
you're on the brink of falling off the cliff, I think
absolutely.
anyway.
Absolutely. I feel like we also see this happening, with idle hands with King David and Bathsheba, right? I mean, everybody else was doing what they were supposed to be doing. King David had too much time on his hands and wasn't engaged in the battle, and that's when he fell in battle, the spiritual battle, and with sin of Bathsheba. But yeah.
I also think of Balaam. Even though his error wasn't adultery, he was still an old man who gave into the sin of greed and died for it,
Mm, yeah.
You know,
So,
that and Josh, you bring up an old man. That is perhaps one of the real tragedies I mean, think about like Phillip Yancey. I think he's 75 now, I think. Or Steve Lawson at age 70. I think that's right. I've got that right. Think of spending your whole life serving the Lord only to get ensnared in some sin towards the end of it, and how just sad that is on the face of it, much less the destruction that it causes.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And I don't know the situation of how these men got involved in these relationships, but it may have started off with something as simple as a compliment by the person they were engaged in this relationship with, affirmation that, wow, you've been so huge as an impact and a leader, and uh, and I feel like maybe that might be where they kind of get off track as well, is they've let pride and flattery kind of enter in, and seeking approval of other people rather than your spouse or even God, and that's huge.
Yeah, for certain. Well, the second possibility here is self righteousness, unintentionally being self satisfied with your spiritual progress. What do you guys think of that?
Well, another passage that comes to mind on the subject specifically of sexual sin. And again, this passage maybe could fall under more than just being self-righteous, but I'll say it here. And that is 1 Corinthians 6:18, just part of it, where Paul says, "Flee immorality." We are told in Scripture how to deal with this temptation, and that is to flee it, to get out of the situation. And that can be applied, I think, in, whether it's scrolling through Facebook and Facebook Reels and stuff starts popping up. That's a temptation, or the beginnings of that. Well, that's how you deal with it, is you turn that off. You don't just keep trying to stand and fight that. You get out of the situation as best you can, I think, is at least that's how I apply to it. But if you're self-righteous and just think that, again, this can't happen to me, or I'm above this, or I can deal with this, well, once again, I would say you're on the brink of destruction.
Right, Jamie. And the instant picture that came to my mind was Joseph and Potiphar, right? Potiphar's wife, rather, that, when that sexual temptation came, he did exactly what it
Yeah.
says in 1 Corinthians. He fled, and he removed himself from the situation, and he left behind it, whatever that meant, But I've often wondered this, that if men worked on their marriages as much as they tried to impress maybe either other men or women of the opposite sex, I don't think there would be this issue of adultery and things nearly as much, you know? But it is mind-boggling and it just blows me away that these men who were but it just goes to show nobody's immune, that were on the verge of finishing well, you know, and how they tripped and stumbled at the finish line of their faith. It's tragic and it's sad, and my heart truly goes out to them and their families over it.
You know, we often talk about midlife crises, but I think there are late age crises too.
Yeah.
I've seen elderly men who don't know when to quit, who try to hold on to their relevancy, who try to hold on to their position or their power, and it's a different kind of stumbling, but it's the same idea that you make it about you instead of the mission.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a different subject for a different time. But a third one is a lack of accountability when you get too old to think you're too good for supervision of any kind. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I guess I've been going first after
Yeah,
when
that's
Josh
fine.
Ask is here. So, one thing that I do think of is this shows the wisdom of God's pattern for the church of a plurality of elders along with the evangelist leading the church, and there's accountability there, or should be there. And unfortunately for denominational world, like sometimes, or maybe a lot of the times, the lead guy, who's often called the pastor, which that's another discussion for another time, but he's like the lead guy, and it's like I could see how you could become like beyond accountability, if you will. You could, especially if you're the kind of personality that can do that. And some people have that personality where they can just to be a strong personality. It's going to be my way, and I'm in charge, and etc. This happens, unfortunately, in our churches too. So I'm not saying our churches are immune to it, but I do think typically in our churches, at least if they're healthy, it doesn't matter how long a preacher's been there. There still should be healthy accountability with the elders to him. And that's a good thing. It should be a good relationship too.
Yeah, this one's tough because part of and one of the benefits of being in a located ministry for any length of time is that you have established trust, right?
Yep. Yep.
And sometimes with that trust comes a lack of accountability. And it just seems like to protect and to shield, I would think that accountability, we should all seek accountability, whether that's from other peers in ministry that we trust and value, or whether that's the elders from a local church. But
Sure.
I feel like comfortability is something that is a detriment to that accountability in some ways. So I don't know how to build those guardrails up higher, maybe.
And Mark, I would just add just a little bit. You mentioned you've built trust, and there is a sense in which you earn trust and you build it, and there's a sense in which you shouldn't just have to keep, there should be a trust that people trust you, moving forwards. That's true. But I think what can happen sometimes is leaders can forget. This gets to this complacency, some of the other stuff we've talked about, can forget how sacred that trust is. When you
Mhm.
forget how sacred the trust is that people put in you, then all of a sudden, and once again, you're on the brink of destruction, I think.
Yep. Yep.
I agree entirely. Marital drift, dead marriage could potentially contribute to this temptation. I'll go first this time. Most certainly, you've been married for 10, 15, or in Yancey's case, 40 plus years. The temptation to get so comfortable as to not try anymore is always going to be there. So, young people, if you're listening to this, hear me out. When you're freshly in love, when you're going through that puppy love stage, it's effortless, it's easy, you're always motivated to invest and to serve. I promise you, the temptation to stop is going to come. And probably all of us been married for quite a while, have had periods, and maybe I shouldn't speak for you too, but I've had periods where I've come to realize, wait, I'm not doing what I should be doing. I haven't invested like I should. I've been ignoring or neglecting this, that, or the other. I need to get back on track. And that's going to happen. So you need to be aware that's going to happen, that temptation's going to occur, and always come back around and realize that your wife comes first after Christ. What do you guys think?
I'll just chime in here too. I feel like you nailed it, Josh. I feel like, and I said this already earlier, but what would happen if we just, as men, if you're in that place of complacency with your spouse, and it's easy to become unsatisfied or more bothered by things that you used to overlook at one time, and if you would just work on the relationship that you have, the intimate relationship that you're supposed to have with your spouse, more so than anything else that might be alluring in that moment, think that you'd be well served. But I think also when it comes to this, with what you just said too, as far as every marriage is going to go through highs and lows. I don't know of any marriage that is the leave it to beaver standard, if you will, of quality with that. But you don't get a good marriage by accident, and so it's going to require you to work at it and to date. And one thing that I want to add to this too, I feel like perhaps, isn't it true that we are good at justifying our own sin in other areas? Perhaps those who have fallen in this area of adultery have somehow justified it wrongfully, just as we wrongfully justify our other behaviors that would say, well, I deserve this, or, I've worked hard for the Lord my whole life. I want to be happy. I want to experience what this person is bringing to me in this moment, if you will. Speculation, and I can't answer that, but I just wonder how much of that is just from self justification because of their own sinful desires.
Yeah, I would just echo what you all are saying here. One thing that I think is important, I could say it at this point, is sometimes I think married couples don't realize that their spouse is always the number one in their life under Christ, I'm saying, not the kids. So that's a huge problem if you get into this thing that, well, my kids are as important as my spouse. Huh? No, no way. Your spouse is always ahead of your kids. And actually, when spouse is ahead of the kids, then you have the potential to become the best parents that you can be, in my thinking, anyway. And so who knows why all these things happen? Some families get so involved in so many activities that it makes it impossible for them, I feel like, to really be a family, at least as good as they could be. And maybe that brings a toll on the marriage. I mean, there are any number of things. Ministry is not always easy, and that can bring difficult days, just it's not even the preacher or his wife's fault, but they're just brings difficulty sometimes. And then you couple that with, I don't remember who I heard this from, but somebody was talking about this subject and saying, then there's always, if it's a male, you know, preacher, in this case we're talking about, there's always a young lady who'll come along and who'll be a listening ear, and then you can almost hear, she understands me. And boy, that's woo, that is, if you're probably already going off the brink of destruction there, but you can see how insidious this is, the deceptive this is, this temptation that Satan has a hand in here. You start coupling together, marital drift, coupled with these other things that we've talked about. And then there's always somebody that's going to come and be a listening ear. And you can just see how that emotional attachment starts. And then the destruction goes from there.
Well, and
Yeah.
and let me just chime in. It also goes to contentment. I feel like if you're discontented, you're going to be looking for grass that is greener, right? I mean,
That's true.
you're going to be fantasizing about, wow, boy, what could they bring to my life if I was with them rather than my current situation? And so I think it has to deal with contentment to some degree too, and finding contentment in your current relationship, your marriage.
If I could just pause a moment and just, if you're listening to this and these kinds of things or similar kinds of things are happening, the Bible has given us the answer. Flee immorality. You need to get out of this routine, get out of this situation,
Amen.
get out of it, and get out of it now. Deal with it ruthlessly. And that is your answer to this right
And
now.
if you're justifying your behavior or your actions in some way, stop. God's desire for you is never to sin. That's God's desire for you.
Many years ago, I had a young man who showed me some text messages between him and, like, he was 18, 19, and she was 15, 16. And it wasn't anything too explicit, but clearly they liked each other and were flirting a lot. And I told him, you need to end this immediately. Like, you need to completely block her, ghost her. Don't even break up with her. You just need to end it. Because he was in a position, he was a youth minister. She was one of the youth girls. And I'm like, if you don't block and ghost, totally stop this 100,000% right now, you're done for.
It's going to blow up. Did he listen? Did he
Yes.
listen? Good.
Yes. Yeah, I scared the tar out of him, and I meant to.
Good.
Because I wanted to see him stay in ministry. He was flirting with the edge of the cliff.
Let me tell you.
Yeah.
That situation you just described happened in a church in our area. Only the young man involved in it was married, had 2 children, was 26 years old. And then the FBI got involved in this situation because it was basically he had sent some inappropriate pictures to this underage female, and now it became a federal case and he faced jail time. I don't know how that court case ended because when it became public, he was immediately terminated from the church he was ministering to.
And by the way, we can see, standing back looking at it, we can see how this deception can happen. And one other factor, preachers and youth ministers are often, they're not always, but they're often very relational oriented people. They're good at it, being, they love people. That's why they're in there doing what they're doing. And so they care about relationships, and boy, that can get twisted in a hurry. And even starting out meaning well, and the boy, it can get twisted. And that's where you have to just say, I'm getting out of this situation.
Yeah. Keep in mind, when Joseph fled Potiphar's wife, he didn't try to explain himself to her. He just ran.
Yeah.
Don't try to reason with this. Get out. Run. That's the only answer.
And can I just point out, while we're talking about Potiphar's wife, it doesn't the accusations that would come, whether true or not, right? I mean, totally are damaging. And so you've got to build those walls of accountability and being above reproach. I mean, goodness, all it takes is an accusation, whether true or not, to really derail God's ministry for your life.
And by the way, I've experienced this even just mentoring young men, where the issue at hand is not going to be anything like adultery or a sexual sin, but there still has to be a professional barrier. Like, if you're going to be at my house, you're going to be at my house with my wife present, with my son present. You're not just going to come over and spend time with me in my
Amen.
home. That's
Yeah.
not going to happen.
Yep.
And that's to protect everybody. And I explained this to them, and I said, when you're in my position one day, it's important you understand this for yourself. You know, I'm not trying to not be your friend or not be a mentor. You just need to know there are professional barriers that are healthy and good.
Which makes
Yeah.
you a better mentor and friend.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it, you know, and once they kind of get over the initial kind of like awkwardness of it, they come to realize that I respect them and I want them to respect what's good for them.
And sadly, guys, and not surprisingly, however, in the culture in which we live, these guardrails, these boundaries have got to be the standard for all sexes, male and female individuals. I feel like in order to protect yourself from any accusations, it used to be you just had to worry about female accusations. Well, now you've got to worry also about male accusations. And so, these guardrails, these standards are, I think, cross all boundaries that way as well.
Yeah. And one last thing I'll say before we move on is another error I've noticed, and this isn't as serious as adultery, but I've noticed a trend where, like you guys were mentioning earlier, how like an older man will have a younger woman say, well, I understand you and all this stuff, and it makes you feel validated or whatever. I've noticed a general trend, and just real recently, of older people confiding in much younger people. I'm not talking like 5, maybe 10 years. I'm talking like 20 plus years difference. And that's a real error in judgment. I'm not saying it necessarily crosses the line of sin, but it's unwise because you're confiding in somebody who knows nothing about what you're talking about. But boy, they can be a yes man for you,
Yeah.
just a
Yeah.
blind disciple. And
And
you need friends and confidants who are somewhat close to your age or older than you within reason.
yeah, I agree with that. And with confidentiality, it automatically produces an intimacy, and it doesn't even have to be a sex. I'm not talking about sexual intimacy. I'm talking about a connection where that we need, right? We need it creates an accountability with that. So wise input on that.
Yeah, I might point out too, I think of the situation of Solomon's son Rehoboam. Remember, they came to him and saying, lighten up your father's yoke on us, and what happened there. And he went to the older people and they said, yeah, you need to do what they're saying. But then he went to his younger friends and they said, oh no, double down and make the yoke heavier. Unfortunately, he made that choice, and it was destructive. Now, if God was going to work through all that, which he did, but I think what you're talking about, though, Josh, about older people going to younger or much younger people, they just haven't had the life experience to be able to say, you need to stop. And, they would, because of their lack of life experiences, they may contribute to stupid decisions.
Yeah, for certain. Well, we're getting low on time, but I figure I'll touch on a couple other possibilities that lead to this temptation of adultery and sexual sin. Let's talk about success and comfort. If you've been in the ministry for a while, or even in just any job, and you've done really well, or at least well enough that you sort of have people who look up to you and all that, it can create a sense of complacency and entitlement. Like, well, I've done the hard work, I've paid the price, now I'm kind of owed some leniency in these areas. And it's justification, like we talked about before. What do you guys think about that?
Well, again, I think when you get to the point when you're saying, I'm just, I'm comfortable, I'm owed some, what'd you say, Josh? Owed some leniency. Once again, coupled with all this stuff we've talked about, you're on the edge of the cliff. You're almost ready to step over the edge of the cliff when you get to that kind of an attitude. And I mean, yeah, I got to say, when you're at a place a long time and you've invested and you've built trust, there is something good in that of having that, but boy, you've got to protect it too. And you can't get so comfortable that you make sinful choices. That's what it boils down to.
Yeah. I'll just chime in on this as well, give my thoughts on that, is be careful with your friendships. Watch and guard your friendships. And I've had friends who are like, well, I'm friends with people of the opposite sex. There's no problem there. Well, I understand that to a degree, but be careful with your friendships, because how do you think those inappropriate relationships start? You think they start as a rendezvous at a secret location? They start off as friendships. And so guard your friendships with the opposite sex. Make sure if you're married that you include your spouse in on that friendship. If that person's married, include their spouse in on the friendship. And so just be really cautious, guard yourself against that. I've seen that lead to many, many issues and problems for a lot of people as well.
Well, before we wrap up, the last one I want to cover real quick is the tendency for men to soften too much with age. And I've seen this, and I think I've even felt it. With age, I'm less upset. I'm less angry. I'm more calm. I just have more general control of my emotions. But also with that is the temptation to be like, is that as important as I think it is? Do I really need to have this debate? Because part of me, the old man ossification is like, I just don't care. And I have to realize that no, the things the Bible talks about matter whether or not I feel like talking about it.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And I think maybe too, Josh, the whole concept that often maybe men become more emotional as they get older. At least I don't know if it happens, how often that happens, but I know I remember my grandfather, tended to be pretty emotional the older that he got, and I see some of that in my own life as well. You're maybe not so much of a hardball on things, and maybe when you're younger, you can be too much of a hardball on stuff, and you need to have a little more grace in how you say things. I mean, maybe we've all been there, but you can't become so soft that you just let sin go and become lenient with sin.
I have honestly nothing to add on that point. I feel like you guys have covered that pretty well. So I'd say back to you, Josh.
Okay. Well, as we wrap up, we want to thank everybody for coming. I appreciate you listening. We're going to have a part 2 on this subject because it's so huge. We could go on about this for a long time. We do want to ask you to reach out to us, not just about questions about this subject, but if you yourself are struggling, please reach out to us at Restoration Movement Conversations at MidwestMinistryTraining.com. That email isn't just for theological discussion. If you're having a crisis of faith, or if you're struggling with temptation, or you want to know how to flee, then we're here for you. We want to help.
Yeah. Amen.
Any closing thoughts, gentlemen?
This is a weighty topic, and it's a pretty serious topic. So our demeanor's been pretty serious through this whole time as well. But I just want to simply thank you, Josh and Jamie. And Josh was our leader on this, and a very timely subject, a very needed subject to discuss, and looking forward to part 2 as well.
All right.
Ditto for me.